The dragon did not bring the curse to the mountain. He found it waiting for him. The gold was already old when Smaug came, already soaked in blood, already responsible for more deaths than any dragon ever caused, already doing what it had always done, which was sit in the dark and wait for the next person who thought they could hold it without being changed by it. No one ever could. Not the elves who first gathered it. Not the men who fought wars over it. Not the dwarves who built their greatest kingdom around it, and called it wealth, and called it glory, and called it the proof of what their people could achieve. The gold did not care what they called it. It just waited. And when Smaug came, when the fire and the ruin came, and the mountain fell silent, I think the gold was not afraid. I think it was patient, because it had survived everything before, and it would survive the dragon too, and pass on to the next set of hands, and the next, and the next. My name is Bavor, son of Bruni. I am a historian of the Broadbeam clan, one of the 7 houses of the Dwarves, and I have spent 60 years of my life tracing the provenance of the treasure that men call Smaug's hoard, not because I was paid to, not because anyone asked me to, but because my grandfather's grandfather was one of the dwarves of Erebor who escaped when Smaug came, who fled down the mountain with nothing but the clothes on his back and spent the rest of his life dreaming about the gold he had left behind, and who died at the end of a long life spent in exile, still dreaming about it, still wanting it, still unable to explain why, and since the gold had not made him happy when he had it, and its absence had not made him happy either. I wanted to understand that, wanted to understand what the gold was that it could do that to a man, to a dwarf who was sensible and hard-working, and not by nature greedy, what it was about that particular gold, in that particular mountain, that turned reasonable people into something else. So I started looking, started tracing, going back through records and songs, and the oral histories of clans who had intersected with that hoard at different points in its long, bloody journey. And what I found was not a story about a dragon. It was not even a story about dwarves. It was a story about gold itself, about what gold is and what it does, and why some gold is more dangerous than other gold, and why the hoard of Erebor was always going to end in fire and ruin, regardless of who held it, because it had ended in fire and ruin before, and before that, and before that, going back further than most people think to look. Let me tell you what I found. Let me tell you where the gold really came from, and let me tell you why Smaug was not the curse. Smaug was just the latest consequence of one. The first thing you have to understand is that not all gold is the same. This sounds like the beginning of a foolish statement. Gold is gold. It is a metal. It comes from the earth. It is found in rivers and mountains, and the deep places where the rock has been compressed and heated over long ages until the pure metal separates from the stone around it. It does not have memory. It does not have intention. It is a substance, and I believed this when I started my research. I do not believe it now. The gold at the heart of what became Smaug's hoard did not begin in Erebor. It did not begin in the Grey Mountains, where the dwarves mined before they came to Erebor. It did not begin anywhere in the north. The oldest pieces, the ones I could trace furthest back, came from Beleriand, from the First Age, from a time before the sun and moon existed in the sky, when the world was lit by the light of the 2 trees, and Morgoth was the name of a god gone wrong, rather than just another dark lord. In Beleriand there were great kingdoms, elven kingdoms of a power and beauty that nothing in the later ages of the world has matched. And in those kingdoms there was wealth. The wealth accumulated over thousands of years of skill and craft, and the particular elven gift for making things that were not just beautiful but true, that captured something essential about what they were supposed to be. Gold worked by elvish hands in the First Age was not merely decorative. It was a statement about the nature of gold, about what gold could be when shaped with full understanding of its properties and full intention of what it should express. Morgoth understood this. Morgoth, who had been one of the greatest of the Ainur before his fall, who had studied the nature of all things in the great music that shaped the world, understood that the elves' wealth was not just valuable as metal, it was valuable as a repository of meaning. And so when he struck, when his armies moved against the kingdoms of Beleriand in the great wars of the First Age, he did not destroy the gold, he took it. The sack of elven cities in the First Age was not random destruction. It was deliberate acquisition. Morgoth wanted the gold and the gems and the great works of elvish craft, not because he needed wealth, but because he understood what wealth meant to those who had created it. Taking it was not just robbery, it was an erasure, a statement that what they had built meant nothing, that everything they valued could be taken and corrupted and hoarded in the dark. And in Angband, in the great fortress of Morgoth, in the north of Beleriand, the gold sat, in vast chambers carved from the living rock, lit by fires that burned cold. They're watched over by creatures that had no interest in the gold itself, but understood that their master wanted it kept. The gold sat there for centuries, in the dark, in the presence of the greatest concentration of evil the world had seen. And if you believe, as I have come to believe, that things absorb something of the nature of where they are and what surrounds them, then you understand what happened to it during those centuries. It was not corrupted in any obvious way. It did not change color or composition. It did not become visibly wrong. It remained gold. Beautiful, heavy, gleaming gold. But it was gold that had spent centuries in Angband, gold that had been taken through violence from those who made it with love, gold that had sat in the dark with Morgoth and absorbed, the way stone absorbs heat, and something of the nature of that proximity, a quality that was not exactly a curse, more like a disposition, a tendency to attract desire, to inflame it, to make those who held it want more of it, always more, until the wanting was larger than the person doing the wanting. I cannot prove this. No historian can prove it. But I can show you what the gold did to every person who held it afterward, across the long centuries of its journey from Angband to Erebor. And you can decide for yourself whether coincidence is sufficient explanation. When Morgoth fell, when the Valar finally came with their armies and unmade his power and cast him into the void, Beleriand was broken. The land itself was destroyed, the sea rushing in to cover most of what had been there. And his fortress was broken open, and the things he had hoarded were scattered, and some of the gold went to the elves who had survived, returned to them or distributed among those who had fought. Some went west, to Ammon, carried by the elves who chose to leave Middle-earth. But some remained. Some of it was simply there, in the ruins of a broken fortress, in a land that was rapidly becoming the bottom of a sea, and the ones who found it were not elves. They were men. The Edain, the men who had fought alongside the elves against Morgoth, were given the island of Numenor as their reward. But not all men who lived in the north of Middle-earth had been Edain. There were others, tribes who had served Morgoth, willingly or not, and tribes who had simply tried to survive in the margins of a war too large for them to influence. and in the chaos that followed Morgoth's defeat. And some of these men found the edges of what had been Angband, found the gold. The records here are fragmentary. The people who found it did not keep detailed accounts. But there are songs, old songs, the kind that get handed down through oral tradition across so many generations that the specifics blur, but the shape remains. And the shape of those songs is consistent. A tribe finds wealth beyond imagining. A tribe that was poor and scattered and surviving on the margins suddenly has gold. And for a short time, perhaps a generation, perhaps two, they flourish. They build, they trade, they become significant in the small politics of their region. And then it falls apart. Every time, the songs are different in their details, different tribes, different locations, different specific causes of the collapse. But the shape is always the same. The wealth that was supposed to solve everything instead becomes the thing that everything else orbits around. Who controls it? Who deserves more of it? Who was promised a share that they haven't received? The arguments begin. Become conflicts. Become wars. The tribe that found the gold ends up fighting over it until there is not enough of the tribe left to hold it. And then someone else comes and takes it. And the cycle begins again. I found records of this gold passing through at least 4 distinct groups of men over the first few centuries after Morgoth's fall. 4 groups, 4 collapses. 4 times the gold moved on because the people holding it had destroyed themselves fighting over it. It was not, I want to be clear, that the gold made them evil. None of these peoples were evil, or they were ordinary people making ordinary choices in the presence of something that made ordinary choices harder. Something that made the reasonable thought, I want more of this, into a thought that drowned out all other reasonable thoughts. And once that drowning began, everything else followed with a logic that was almost mechanical, almost inevitable. Eventually the gold moved north and east, through trades and raids and the slow drift of valuable things through the networks of the early world. Pieces of it accumulated in the hands of an elven lord of the Second Age, whose name I won't use here, because his descendants still live. And what I am about to say is not kind. He was not a great lord, not one of the famous names. He ruled a small domain in the eastern reaches of Erebor, as a wooded land with a small population of elves who had chosen not to go to Lindon and not to go west, and who lived quietly and well under his governance. By all accounts, he was a capable ruler, fair, attentive to the needs of his people. He had governed for several centuries without significant complaint. He acquired the gold through a trade, a legitimate transaction. He gave something of value in exchange for something of value, as people do, and the gold came into his treasury, and for a few decades nothing changed. He continued to rule well. His people continued to flourish. The gold sat in the treasury and was what gold is: metal, heavy, gleaming, useful for trade and craft and the making of beautiful things. And then, slowly, it was not just that anymore. His people noticed the change before he did. Small things at first. He spent more time in the treasury. He began to keep more detailed accounts of exactly what was there, checking them more frequently than any practical purpose required. He became interested in acquiring more, not because he needed it, his domain was prosperous, but because the amount he had didn't feel like enough, had never felt like enough, though he could not have explained why. He hadn't felt this way before the gold came. He was certain of that, in the way that someone is certain of something they cannot quite remember the origin of. He commissioned works, magnificent works, jewelry and decorative objects and architectural elements of gold that served no practical purpose but filled his halls with the gleam of it. And the works were beautiful. His people said so, sincerely, because they were. But they also noticed that he never gave any of it away, that it accumulated without purpose, without direction, without any of the generosity that had characterized his rule before. He became cold to his people, not cruel, not unjust exactly, just absent in a way that was new. His attention was elsewhere. When he listened to their concerns, it was with the patience of someone waiting for a conversation to end so they could return to something more important. And what was more important was always the treasury, always the accounting, always the question of whether he had as much as he had yesterday, and whether that was enough, and the answer was always no. He ruled for another 2 centuries in this diminished way. And then there was a war, a small war by the standards of the age, a conflict with a neighboring territory over a border that both sides claimed, the kind of conflict that capable rulers resolve through negotiation, and that he would have resolved through negotiation in his earlier centuries of rule. Instead, he fought, committed his people to a war they did not want over land that was not worth the blood it cost, because the territory in question had rivers that ran through gold-bearing rock, and he wanted what was in those rivers. He lost the war. Lost badly. His domain was diminished. His people's trust in him, which had survived 2 centuries of his cold distraction, did not survive the war. There was not a revolt, exactly. But there was a departure. Elves who could leave did. Went to Lindon, went west, went anywhere that was not there. They under the rule of someone who had traded their people's well-being for a war over gold. And when enough of them had gone, the domain simply ceased to function. There were not enough people to maintain it. He was left in his halls with his treasury and a small group of the most loyal or the most stubborn, and he ruled over less and less until there was nothing left to rule. The gold passed on. He did not give it willingly. It was taken in a raid years later, when his diminished household couldn't defend it. He lived for a long time after that, I believe. Elves do. But I could find no further record of what became of him. Only the gold, moving east, moving north, moving toward the mountains. The first dwarves to hold the gold in significant quantity were of the Firebeard clan, one of the 7 houses, who mined in the southern Grey Mountains in the early Third Age. They acquired it piece by piece over several generations of trade, each acquisition seeming reasonable, each piece worth what was paid for it. No single transaction was remarkable. The accumulation was. By the time a king called Dar, son of Dolgrin, held the throne of their small mountain kingdom, roughly a quarter of what would eventually become Smaug's hoard was in his treasury. And Dar was, by the accounts of his own people, a king in the grip of something they could not name, but could describe precisely. He checked the treasury every day, sometimes twice. He knew the count of every coin, the weight of every ingot, the dimensions of every worked piece. His memory for these details was extraordinary, and in any other context might have been called a gift. But in this context it was something else. He was generous in one specific way. He paid well. Anyone who brought him gold, through trade or tribute or the discovery of new veins in his mines, was rewarded beyond what the market required, because he wanted more, always more. And the generosity that might in other circumstances have made him beloved, made him instead surrounded by people who understood exactly what he wanted and were willing to provide it at the price he was willing to pay. His downfall was a mine, a new vein discovered deep in the mountain, richer than anything his people had worked before. He drove them hard to extract it, harder than was safe. The dwarves who worked those mines came to him with concerns about the supports, about the depth they were reaching, or about signs in the stone that experienced miners recognized as warnings. He heard them, listened to their specific concerns with the attention he no longer gave to most other things, and dismissed them, because the vein was rich and he wanted what was in it. The collapse came on a morning when 200 dwarves were in the lower tunnels. Most of them didn't come out. The mountain itself was structurally compromised. Dar's kingdom didn't survive the disaster, not because the collapse destroyed it physically, though it damaged it severely, but because no people will follow a king who spent 200 of them for gold. He was not deposed. He was simply no longer obeyed. And a king who is not obeyed is not a king. He died within a decade, still in possession of his treasury, which was cold comfort. The gold passed to his successor, who had the sense to move his people west out of the damaged mountain and establish a new settlement in the foothills. And some of the gold was used to fund that establishment, genuinely used, put to practical purpose. And perhaps, for a generation, the curse loosened its grip. Perhaps distance from the largest concentration of it, the dispersal of some into actual use, thinned whatever quality it carried. But the core of it remained. The oldest pieces, the ones that had come from furthest back, were kept. Because they were the most beautiful. Because they were irreplaceable. Because no one could quite bring themselves to spend them, even when spending would have been practical and wise. And so the core remained, waiting as it had always waited. Or the story I find hardest to tell is the one that brought the gold to the attention of the dwarves of Erebor, because it involves men. 3 brothers, merchants of the northern trade routes, who came into possession of a significant portion of the hoard through means that were legal at the time and would not be considered legal now. They were traders in the old sense, men who moved goods between communities that could not easily reach each other, who bought where things were cheap and sold where they were needed, and grew wealthy in the margins between those two prices. They were good at it, had a genuine gift for logistics, for relationship building, for the particular kind of trust that makes trade possible between strangers. By the time the eldest was 50 years old, they had built something that was nearly an empire of commerce, was with roots stretching from the Iron Hills to the Misty Mountains and south to the edges of Rohan. They took the gold as settlement of a debt, a dwarf community that had borrowed heavily to survive a hard winter, and could not repay in coin, repaid in gold instead. The brothers accepted, because the gold was worth more than the debt, and because they had the merchant's eye for a good transaction. And they were right that it was worth more. They were wrong that this made it a good transaction. The trouble began with the valuation. They agreed among themselves, the 3 brothers, that the gold should be valued, and the value divided equally, 1/3 to each. This was their practice with all jointly held assets. It had worked for 20 years of partnership. It did not work here, because the valuation was not straightforward, and some of the gold was worked into objects whose value was partly the metal and partly the craft, and the craft was not easy to price, and the brothers who had never seriously disagreed about a valuation before found they could not agree about these. The disagreement was small at first. The eldest valued the worked pieces high, believing the craft added significantly to the worth. The middle brother valued them at metal weight only, believing craft was subjective and only the material was reliably tradable. The youngest sided sometimes with one and sometimes with the other, which satisfied neither. They argued. They reached temporary agreements that came unstuck when one of them reconsidered. They brought in outside appraisers whose conclusions they disputed. The valuation process that should have taken weeks took years. and during those years the gold sat in a shared warehouse, unallocated, belonging to all three equally, and therefore to none of them specifically, which meant each of them suspected the others of finding ways to informally claim more than their share. The suspicion was not entirely unfounded. Small pieces went missing, moved between accounts in ways that each brother explained differently. The trust that had made their partnership function, that had been the real foundation of their commercial success, cracked and cracked and cracked until it broke. The legal dispute that followed destroyed the business. The roots they had spent 20 years building required all three of them, or at least required their cooperation, and the cooperation was gone. Partners chose sides. Employees left. Creditors, sensing instability, called in debts at the worst possible moment. The commercial empire that the three brothers had built over 2 decades came apart in 3 years. And at the end of it, when the lawyers had finished, and the courts had ruled, and the dust had settled, the gold was all that remained. Divided at last, 1/3 to each, and each third was worth significantly less than it would have been if they had simply sold it when they acquired it, before the dispute began. The eldest brother sold his third immediately and used the proceeds to start again, smaller, humbler, without his brothers. He did reasonably well. I mention this because it matters. The one who let go of the gold recovered. The ones who did not were not so fortunate. The middle brother kept his third, could not bring himself to sell it. The valuation dispute had made him certain that other people would cheat him if given the opportunity, and selling felt like an opportunity for cheating. So he held it, and held it. And the holding became its own trap, because the gold he was not selling was capital he could not deploy, which meant his attempts to rebuild his commercial position were always underfunded, always slightly short of what they needed to succeed. He died 20 years later, not in poverty, but in the persistent frustration of a man who could see what he needed and could not quite reach it. The gold went to his children, who sold it immediately, and good for them. The youngest brother's story is the one I wish I had not found. He had been the peacemaker during the dispute, the one who tried to find middle ground, and the failure of the peace had hit him hardest. He developed a belief in the years after the dissolution of the partnership that the gold was specifically and personally responsible for what had happened to his family. Not in the vague way I am suggesting, a quality, a tendency, something absorbed through long proximity to darkness, in a specific, intentional, directed way. He believed it was alive, that it had wanted to destroy them, that it had manipulated the valuation dispute from the inside, had nudged their suspicions, had fed their worst interpretations of each other's actions. He was not entirely wrong about what the gold did. He was wrong about how it did it. It did not need intention. It did not need to be alive in any meaningful sense. It just needed to be desirable enough that people could not think clearly in its presence. That was sufficient. That had always been sufficient. He spent the rest of his life trying to warn people about it, wrote pamphlets that no one read, accosted strangers in markets, made himself a figure of pity and ridicule in the towns where he lived. His gold, his third of the hoard, he refused to sell and refused to use and refused to give away because he was afraid of what it would do to whoever received it. He kept it in a box under his bed and slept badly, and died old and frightened. And his children, who had watched this, sold the gold immediately, and the proceeds passed into the general stream of commerce and were unremarkable, and that branch of the story ends there. But the middle brother's gold, and the worked pieces that had been the heart of the dispute, the most beautiful and most ancient of the pieces, those found their way north, or into the mountains, into the hands of traders who sold them to the Dwarves of Erebor, who paid well for fine gold, and especially for worked pieces of obvious age and quality. And so the oldest pieces, the ones that had come furthest, made the last leg of their journey into the mountain that would become their home for the next several centuries. You know the story of Erebor. Everyone does. The lonely mountain, greatest of the dwarf kingdoms of the Third Age. The wealth that accumulated there over centuries of mining and craft and trade. The gold that Thror gathered and hoarded and built his identity and his dynasty around. The dragon sickness. The madness that took Thror in his later years, and that echoed in his grandson Thorin centuries later. What you may not know is that the dragon sickness was not new to Erebor, was not something Smaug caused, or even significantly accelerated. The records of Thror's court, the ones I was able to access through the generosity of certain dwarf archivists who understood what I was trying to do, show a pattern that began long before Smaug appeared on the horizon. 3 generations before Thror, a king called Nar III, which is an undistinguished name that reflects an undistinguished reign, began keeping unusual records, detailed inventories of the treasury, updated weekly, marginal notes on the inventories expressing concern about whether certain pieces were being properly accounted for, whether the weight of certain ingots matched their recorded weight from the previous inventory, whether there was any possibility that pieces were being moved without his knowledge. Of the notes began as administrative caution and became, over a reign of 60 years, something that looks very much like paranoia. His successor was better, or appeared better. But the treasury records from his reign show something interesting. The inventory checks that Nar had conducted weekly, his successor conducted monthly, then quarterly, then, in his later years, weekly again. As if something about the gold required checking, required the reassurance of knowing it was still there, still his, still the same amount it had been before. By Thror's time, this pattern had become a tradition. The king checked the treasury. This was simply what kings of Erebor did. No one questioned it. No one connected it to the pattern I am describing because they could not see the pattern. Each generation experienced only their own king's behavior, and each king's behavior seemed like a personal quirk, an intensification of a characteristic that had always been present rather than an expression of something the gold was doing to all of them in sequence. And then Thror's gold sickness became undeniable even to those who had been rationalizing it for years. The hoarding of the Arkenstone, the refusal to share wealth with the people of Dale and with Thranduil of the Woodland Realm, who had legitimate grievances about unpaid debts, the retreat into the treasury, the days spent simply sitting among the gold, the anger that came over him whenever someone suggested that some of the wealth might be put to use outside the mountain. It was not subtle at that point. His own advisors saw it. His family saw it. But by then the gold sickness was too advanced to address, as Thror was too powerful to compel, and so they watched and waited and hoped it would resolve itself. It resolved itself with a dragon. I have thought a great deal about Smaug's arrival, about what drew him to Erebor specifically. There were other dwarf kingdoms. There were other concentrations of wealth in the north. But Smaug came to Erebor, flew from the mountains of the north with specific intention, following something, drawn by something. Dragons are drawn to gold. This is known. It is part of their nature, the great, cold intelligence of them combined with the hoarding instinct that seems to be fundamental to what they are. But what draws a dragon to one concentration of gold rather than another? What made Erebor the destination? I believe the gold called him. not through any magical mechanism, or not through a spell or an enchantment, but through the same quality that had been drawing people to it and destroying them for 3,000 years. The gold was desirable in a way that exceeded its material worth. It always had been. And that excessive desirability had a reach, a gravity, that extended into the world around it and pulled toward itself anyone with the capacity to feel it. And dragons feel it more strongly than anyone. Smaug came. The mountain fell, the dwarves fled, and the gold sat in the dark again, as it had sat in the dark of Angband, waiting, patient as always, not concerned. Smaug was just another holder, another temporary custodian. The gold had outlasted everyone who had ever held it, and it would outlast the dragon too. It did outlast the dragon. Smaug died. The quest of Thorin Oakenshield succeeded, after a fashion. Thorin himself died of his wounds at the Battle of 5 Armies, in the grip of the same dragon sickness that had taken his grandfather, unable even at the end to let go of what the gold had made him. But the mountain was reclaimed. The gold was distributed, shared among the survivors of the battle, among the people of Dale, among the elves of the woodland realm. It went out into the world in many directions at once. I find this the most frightening part of the whole story. When the gold was in Angband, it was in one place. When it was in the hands of a series of individual owners, it was in one place. When it was in Erebor, it was in one place. You could trace it. You could follow it. You could see the pattern of what it did, because the pattern had a location, a concentration, a center you could point to. And after the Battle of 5 Armies, it dispersed. Hundreds of recipients, perhaps thousands, when you count the coins that passed through Dale's markets into the hands of ordinary people who had no idea where their change had come from. The gold that had once been Morgoth's, that had sat in Angband for centuries, absorbing whatever quality proximity to that darkness gives to things, went out into the world in pieces too small to track. Most of it is harmless, I think. Diluted enough. Far enough from the core pieces. Changed enough hands in the normal way of commerce that whatever it carried has been dispersed into the general flow of the world's gold and is no more notable than any other metal. But the core pieces, the oldest ones, the ones that had been in Angband and had come furthest. I do not know where all of them are, and some went to Thranduil's treasury. Some went to Dane Ironfoot, who became king under the mountain after Thorin's death. Some went to Bard the bowman and his heirs, who rebuilt Dale with the wealth of the mountain, and whose descendants are the lords of that city now. These are powerful people, holding old gold, and I have spent enough time in the records of their families to notice patterns I would rather not have noticed. Not dramatic patterns, not gold sickness of the kind that took Thror. Just a tendency, a slight excess of attention to wealth, a slight insufficiency of generosity in certain specific moments. Small things, the kind of thing you could easily explain as coincidence or character. But I have been doing this for 60 years. I know what the pattern looks like in its early stages, and I know how small and reasonable it appears at the beginning, how easily explained, how thoroughly deniable. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you have been listening to this account, and something in it feels familiar, something about what gold does to the people who hold it, something about how desire for wealth becomes desire that crowds out everything else, then you understand something that most people spend their lives avoiding. If you want to hear more stories like this, more accounts from those who looked at the history of the world and found things they wished they had not found, then stay and listen. Subscribe to Whispers from the Shire. Because the past is not finished with us. Thank you. I want to be careful about what I am claiming. I am not saying the gold of Erebor is evil in any simple sense. I am not saying that everyone who has ever held a coin from Smaug's hoard is doomed. I am not saying that the curse is inescapable, or that the pattern I have identified is destiny rather than tendency. I am saying that there is something about certain gold, gold that has been through certain things, gold that has been desired with sufficient intensity by a sufficient number of people over a sufficient length of time, that makes it more than metal, that makes it carry something, a charge, like a stone that has been sitting in the sun and is warm to the touch long after the sun has set. The warmth fades, given enough time, given enough distance, given enough hands through which the gold passes on its way to becoming ordinary. But the oldest pieces are still warm. I am certain of it. I have held some of them, or pieces in the collection of Thranduil's treasury that a particular archivist allowed me to examine, under supervision, for academic purposes. Old worked pieces. Elvish craft, very old, the kind that could only have been made in the First Age, when the techniques were different and the intention behind them was different. And they were beautiful. Undeniably, achingly beautiful. The most beautiful objects I have ever seen or touched. And I put them down after 10 minutes, because I became aware, in those 10 minutes, that I did not want to put them down, that I was already, in 10 minutes, beginning to calculate whether there was any way I could justify holding them longer. Any academic purpose that would require extended examination, any argument I could make to the archivist for extended access, and I recognized that calculation, and I had spent 60 years documenting what that calculation led to, and I put them down, and I walked out of the treasury and sat in the courtyard outside and breathed the open air for a long time. And then I went back to my notes, because the work still needed doing, because someone needs to know where the gold has been and what it has done, and what it is still capable of doing. Not to destroy it. I do not think it can be destroyed any more than gold can be unmade, but to watch it, to name what it is, to make sure that when the pattern begins again, and I believe it will begin again, somewhere, in some treasury, in some family, in some king who starts checking his accounts a little more frequently than he used to, someone is paying attention. The dragon didn't bring the curse to the mountain. He found it waiting. And when he died, when the gold went out into the world in 1,000 directions at once, the curse did not end. It dispersed. It became harder to see, harder to trace, harder to name. But it is still there, in the oldest pieces, in the gold that came from furthest back, sitting in treasuries that belong to kings and merchants who have no idea what they are holding, waiting, as it has always waited, for the next person who thinks they can hold it without being changed by it. No one ever can. My name is Bavor, son of Bruni. I have spent 60 years following this gold through the history of the world, and I am telling you now, as an old dwarf who knows what gold does and has chosen to live simply and hold very little of it, that the hoard of Erebor was never really Smaug's. It was never Thror's. It was never the elven lords or Dars or the three brothers. It has never truly belonged to anyone. It has only ever passed through hands on its way to the next set of hands, and every pair of hands it passed through held it too tightly and gave up too much for it, and were diminished by the experience of letting it go. Every single one. Watch the gold. Watch what it does to the people who hold it. Watch the small changes, the slightly more frequent accounting, the slightly less generous impulse, the slightly longer pause before sharing. These are the early signs, and if you see them in yourself, in someone you love, in a king whose rule was once fair and is becoming something else, remember what I have told you. Remember where the gold came from. Remember what it has done before, and consider, very seriously, putting it down